The morning Patience Hartley stood in the doorway of the Marrow House drawing room and heard her own engagement announced to 30 strangers. She was wearing a gown of slate gray wool that had been retrimmed twice and still showed the ghost of its original hem. The room was warm with candlelight, crowded with the particular brightness that London society produced when it gathered to observe something it expected to enjoy, and 30 pairs of eyes turned toward her with an identical expression, the expression of people who have already made up their minds and are merely waiting for confirmation. She stood very still. Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Marrow, stood at the center of the room with his hands clasped at his back and his face arranged into a composure so absolute it might have been carved there. And he said, in a voice that carried without effort, that he wished his guests to know of his intention to marry Miss Patience Hartley of Dorset. The room received this information the way a pond receives a stone, with a momentary disturbance and then a swift return to its own surface. A woman near the window, whose name Patience did not yet know, leaned toward her companion and said something too low to hear, but the shape of her lips was not difficult to read. What Edmund's eyes held in the moment he looked across the room at Patience, she could not determine. He looked at her directly, and then he looked away. And the room arranged itself around the announcement as though it had always expected this, and had simply been waiting for the formality. She had not expected to be chosen at all. That was the wound the season had been carving into her since March. Slowly, and without particular hurry, the way cold water shapes stone. Patience had come to London in the company of her brother Silas, in what was technically her 3rd season. Though her circumstances had changed so substantially between the 2nd and the 3rd that they did not feel continuous. Their father, a clergyman of Modest, living in Dorset, had died the previous autumn, leaving Patience, 24 years old, possessed of a good education, a reasonable French, and a passable pianoforte, and very little else. The living had reverted. The house had been vacated. Silas, who was 21, and had inherited not the living but his father's particular kindness, and his father's particular inability to say no to an urgent request, had arrived in London 6 months before Patience and had, within 4 months, accumulated a debt of £3,000 to a man named Carew, a creditor whose business address was in Threadneedle Street, and whose methods of collection were not gentlemanly. £3,000. Patience had sat with the figure in her father's old study, the one she had borrowed for a single afternoon before the house was returned to the parish, and she had turned it over the way one turns over a stone to find what lies beneath it. There was nothing beneath it except more of the same. Cold arithmetic. She had come to London knowing the arithmetic. She had not come expecting to solve it through marriage, because she had spent enough time in drawing rooms to understand that a woman of no fortune, no connections, and a Dorset clergyman's address was not the solution any family of standing was seeking. She expected to find a situation as a companion, perhaps, or a governess. She expected to endure. What she had not expected was the Duke of Marrow. He was not the kind of man one expected to encounter by accident, and yet the encounter had been precisely that. Silas, in the desperate and slightly feverish logic of a young man who has run out of options, had written to Edmund Ashford requesting a private interview. Edmund had granted it, which surprised Patience, and had then conducted it with a briskness that surprised her further, receiving Silas in the library at Marrow House for 40 minutes, and emerging with an expression that told her nothing. He had spoken to her afterward for perhaps 8 minutes in the corridor outside the library. He had said he understood her situation. He had said he proposed a formal engagement, which would allow Silas time to settle his affairs without the threat of Carew's collection, and which would provide her with a position of social stability while the matter resolved. He had said he understood this was a considerable ask and would not press her for an immediate answer. His face throughout had been the same carved composure she would come to know well. Patience had stood in the corridor with her hands folded at her waist, and had said she would consider it, and had spent precisely 1 sleepless night considering it, and had sent her answer by hand the following morning. The answer was yes. She had told herself it was for Silas. It was for Silas, but in the corridor outside the library, in the 8 minutes, Edmund had said one other thing, almost as an addition, almost as though it were procedural rather than personal. He had said, "I am aware this is not the engagement you would have chosen." And the fact that he was aware of it, that he had named it without being asked, had lodged somewhere in her chest and stayed there. Lady Dorothea Ashford, Duchess of Merrow. By the title she had carried for 30 years and ceded without apparent difficulty to no one, received the news of the engagement in the yellow morning room with her fan held at precisely the angle that indicated she was preparing to be displeased. Patience was present because she had been invited for tea, which she now understood had been an assessment rather than a welcome. The fan moved once, twice, and then Dorothea set it in her lap. "A clergyman's daughter from Dorset," she said, to the woman seated at her left, a Mrs. Penhaligon who collected information the way others collected porcelain. Edmund has always been governed by impulse dressed as principal. Mrs. Penhaligon murmured something sympathetic. "She has nothing," Dorothea said pleasantly, as though commenting on the weather. "A decent enough face, I suppose, but a face is not a fortune, and Merrow does not need a face." Patience sat across the low table with her teacup warm in her hands, and her expression exactly as composed as she could make it, which was, she had been told, very composed indeed. She drank her tea. She remarked on the arrangement of roses in the window. She allowed Lady Dorothea to believe the words had not landed. They had landed. They always landed. The drawing-room gathering at Merrow House 3 weeks into the engagement was a different kind of ordeal, more crowded than the yellow morning room, and less precisely aimed. Dorothea had arranged it with the specific efficiency of a woman who knows how rooms work, placing Miss Cecily Vane, who was 19 and brilliant, and possessed of £8,000, and a mother with connections in 3 counties, near the fireplace where the light was most favorable. Cecily was not unkind by nature. She was simply very certain. The way people are certain when their entire life has confirmed their assumptions. She moved through the room with the ease of someone who has never been looked at and found wanting. Edmund's ward was a girl of 11 named Clara, the daughter of a cousin who had died in the 4th year of the war. Clara had been at Merrow House for 2 years, and had the particular quality of children who have lost the people who made them feel certain of themselves, a watchfulness, a habit of reading the room before deciding how to exist in it. She appeared in the drawing-room doorway mid-afternoon, looking for her governess, and found instead Miss Cecily, Vane's closest friend, a young woman named Miss Alderton, who said, without looking at Clara directly, "Oh, the little orphan. Someone should put her in the nursery where she belongs." It was said lightly, the way truly careless cruelty is always said, with no particular emphasis, as though it were simply obvious. Patience set down her cup. She crossed the room in 8 steps, not hurrying, not visibly sharp. She knelt, so that she was level with Clara's face, and said, in a voice quiet enough that only the near chairs could hear, "I was looking for you. Come and sit with me." There is a window seat in the east corner that no one has claimed, and it has an excellent view of the garden. She took Clara's hand. Clara looked at her with those watchful eyes, calculated something, and went. Edmund was standing at the edge of the room near the tall bookcase. Patience did not see him. She had not thought to look. She was thinking only about the set of Clara's small shoulders, and whether she had succeeded in preventing the child from hearing what had been said, or only in preventing her from having to stand alone with it. He had seen everything. She would not know this for weeks. The first time Dorothea voiced her preferred interpretation of Patience within earshot of others at a social gathering, it was in the corridor outside a musicale at Lady Stanton's house in Grosvenor Square. The occasion was mid-May, the season at its warmest and most crowded, and Dorothea was speaking to the Countess of Harefield in tones that could have passed for private, but were calibrated, Patience understood, to carry. "A provisional arrangement," Dorothea said. "Edmund is conscientious to a fault. She required assistance, and he provided it. That is his character." it does not follow that the arrangement is permanent. The Countess of Harefield said nothing, which was the correct response when one did not wish to be implicated. A provincial girl with no money and no family, Dorothea continued. She will find her feet eventually, I am sure. Somewhere appropriate to her station. Patience continued along the corridor without pausing. Her feet were quite steady. She noted, as she walked, that Dorothea's confidence had the particular quality of a woman who has never been wrong in a context she controlled, and that such confidence, if it remained unchallenged long enough, eventually became indistinguishable from fact. This worried her. The library at Marrow House was on the second floor north-facing, with windows that looked onto the kitchen garden, and a pair of armchairs near the grate that had been used enough to be genuinely comfortable rather than merely upholstered. It was there, in the second week of June, that Patience began to revise certain assumptions about Edmund Ashford. She had come early in the morning to return a volume she had borrowed from the lower shelf, not expecting the room to be occupied. He was standing at the window with a letter in his hand and his coat off, in his shirt sleeves, which was not the composure she was accustomed to. He turned when she entered, and for one unguarded moment his face held something she had no name for. Something that was not coldness and was not the polished distance he wore in company. He said Miss Hartley, and the distance came back, but not entirely. She returned the volume and would have left. He said, "Do not go on my account. I was about to put the letter away in any case." She stayed, because the request was phrased as a statement, and she was still learning to read the difference. They sat on opposite sides of the grate with their respective books, not speaking, for perhaps 20 minutes. The kitchen garden was visible through the window, a row of young sweet peas making their way up their canes in the June light, and the fire had been laid low against the morning chill. Patience was aware of him in the way one is aware of weather, not looking directly, but knowing the atmospheric condition precisely. She was also aware, with a quietness that she did not examine too closely, that she had not felt at ease in a room since Dorset, and that she felt something approaching it now. He said, without preliminary, "Silas told me he wrote to you about Carew before he came to me." "He did," she said. "He did not tell you he had already tried twice to address it himself." She looked up from her book. "He did not want you to know he had failed." "Twice," Edmund said. He was looking at the fire, not at her. "He thought you would think less of him. I would not have." "I know that," Edmund said. "I told him so." She absorbed this. The fire settled. Outside, a sparrow landed on one of the sweet pea canes and reconsidered. If you find yourself moved by what Patience and Edmund are building here, quietly and against every pressure the season is assembling against them, stay close. This story is not finished with either of them yet. "May I ask you something?" she said. "You may. Why did you agree to see him? You had no reason to." Edmund was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer. "I had reasons," he said. "They were mine." And then, so quietly that the words almost fell into the fire rather than across it, I recognized the letter. She did not ask what he meant. She understood, in the way one understands things one has not been explicitly told, that there had been a time when he had also required assistance he did not know how to ask for, and that no one had been in the corridor to grant it. She understood this the way one understands weather, without requiring a full account of the atmosphere. It was also in the library 2 days later that she found the portrait leaning against the inside of the East Gallery door, its face turned to the wall. A woman in white, early-style brushwork, mid-20s, if the subject had been truthfully rendered. The gilt frame was dusty with long disuse, as though it had stood that way for some years without being moved. She did not ask about it. She mentioned at dinner that evening that the East Gallery light was very fine in the afternoon, and she imagined paintings kept well there. Edmund's jaw tightened fractionally. He said, "The gallery is not currently in use." Later she learned from Mrs. B. Holt, the housekeeper, who had been at Marrow Hall for 22 years and felt no obligation to be oblique about matters of fact, that the portrait was of Edmund's first wife, Caroline, who had died of a fever in the autumn 3 years before. That he had been in Wiltshire when she fell ill in London, attending an estate matter he had judged pressing. That by the time he reached London, the fever had done its work. That he had turned the portrait to the wall himself the morning after the funeral and had not touched it since. Mrs. Holt said all of this, without particular drama, the way someone recounts a fact that has simply become part of the house's constitution. She added that his Grace had been a different person before, lighter in some way she could not precisely name, and that the past 3 years had made him the composed and careful and somewhat airless man Patience had been engaged to. Patience sat with this for a long time. It did not make the composure easier to receive. It made it more legible, and legibility, she was learning, could be its own kind of closeness. The ballroom at Lord Ashwell's house in Berkeley Square held perhaps 200 guests on the evening of the Midsummer Assembly. And Dorothea had arranged herself and Cecily, Vane and Cecily's mother, in a configuration near the top of the room that could only be read one way. Cicely was in pale gold, which the candlelight rendered spectacular. She was laughing at something a young lord had said, her fan moving with the easy confidence of a woman who has never been made to feel that her presence required justification. Edmund was nearby as social requirement demanded, and Dorothea spoke to him for several minutes with her hand on his arm and her head slightly inclined, the posture of a woman conducting necessary business. Patience stood near the musicians with a glass of lemonade and watched. She was wearing the slate gray wool again, which she now recognized as a decision rather than a circumstance. She could have accepted the loan Silas had offered, extracted from some corner of his dwindling resources. She had not. There was a clarity in the gray wool that the loan would have muddied, and she wanted to be clear even if clarity was the only thing she could afford. A woman beside her, one of Mrs. Plant, Penhaligon's particular friends, said without lowering her voice, "She is very plain to have secured a duke. One does wonder what the arrangement actually costs him." Patience set her lemonade down on the nearest tray without drinking from it. Edmund was watching from across the room. She did not see this. She was watching the musicians, her face perfectly still, doing the thing she had learned to do in difficult rooms, which was to locate one fixed and neutral point and anchor her attention there until her heart resumed its normal pace. He watched her do it. The composure did not look like indifference to him. It looked like something being held together by a specific effort of will, and the effort was visible if you were paying attention, and he was always paying attention to her, which was a fact he had not yet examined directly. Dorothea appeared at Patience's elbow an hour later, when Edmund was occupied at the far end of the room. "You have managed admirably," Dorothea said pleasantly. "The season is taxing for everyone. I imagine someone in your position finds it more taxing than most." "The season is a considerable undertaking," Patience agreed. "Edmund is a conscientious man," Dorothea said, adjusting her glove. "He takes his obligations very seriously. That has always been his particular quality, his sense of obligation." She paused. "It is not always the same as preference, of course. One learns to distinguish the two." Patience looked at her directly. "I find they are often closer than people allow," she said. Dorothea smiled. The smile did not reach her eyes. "How optimistic," she said. "How provincial." 3 days after the assembly, Dorothea came to the house on Clarges Street, where Patience and Silas were lodging, and she was shown upstairs, and she sat in the small parlor with its view of the street and its borrowed furniture, and she said what she had come to say. "Carew holds the note on your brother's debt," she said. £3,000. He is a connection of mine, through my solicitor. Now, I have asked him to consider calling the debt immediately, which he is within his legal rights to do, and which he is prepared to do within the fortnight, unless you withdraw from the engagement. She let this settle. "I am not asking you to be unkind to my son. I am asking you to see the situation clearly. You are not what Marrow requires. You know this. I believe you have known it since the corridor." Patience sat across from her with her hands flat on her knees and the window light behind Dorothea, and the specific quality of the moment very clear to her. The way moments are clear when the thing one has been dreading arrives, and one discovers one already knows its shape. "I would like 24 hours," she said. "I will give you 12, Dorothea said. She sat alone in the parlor after Dorothea left, and she thought about £3,000 and a creditor and a brother, who had tried twice before he came to Edmund and had told no one. She thought about the portrait turned to the wall in the morning in the library, with the sweet peas going up their canes and the 8 minutes in the corridor, when Edmund had said, "I am aware this is not the engagement you would have chosen," and had said it as though her awareness of her own situation mattered to him. She thought about Clara's hand in hers and Edmund's face in the unguarded moment when she had entered the library, and he had not had time to compose it. She thought he deserves better than a woman who stayed because she had nowhere else to go. If she remained now, under this threat, every day of the engagement would carry the shape of Dorothea's ultimatum. She would know, every day, that she had not left when she could have. He would not know, but she would. And she was not willing to build a life on a foundation she alone could see was compromised. She took out paper. She wrote 8 words. She folded the note around the engagement ring, which was a small oval sapphire in a gold setting that she had worn on her right hand, because it was slightly large for her left, and she sealed it and addressed it to Edmund at Marrow House. She wrote to Silas's lodgings on Pall Mall and told him nothing of the debt or of Dorothea, only that she was returning to Dorset for personal reasons and would write from there. She arranged the post-chaise for 5 in the morning. She packed the 2 trunks that had come up from Dorset in March, and set them by the door, and sat in the parlor with the candle burning, and did not sleep. The note reached Marrow House at 7 in the morning by means of the regular delivery which was sorted in the front hall by Edmund's secretary. The secretary who had served Edmund for 6 years and had no difficulty reading an engagement ring through an envelope, brought it directly upstairs. Edmund sat at the table in his dressing room with the ring in his palm, and the note unfolded, and read at once the 8 words were, "You should be free to choose. I am." He read them again. He was a man who had trained himself, across 3 years of methodical private grief, to receive difficult information without visible response. He had turned a portrait to the wall. He had managed an estate with exemplary precision. He had discharged every obligation that had presented itself to him, and had felt, in the discharging, not peace, but the approximation of function. He read the 8 words a 3rd time, and then he set the note down on the table with the ring resting on top of it, and sat very still for perhaps 40 seconds. Something in his chest that had been contracted for 3 years opened a fraction, and then contracted, again sharply, because she was gone. He rang for his man and asked whether the post-chaise hired by Miss Hartley at Clarges Street had departed. It had departed before 6. He asked which road to Dorset. He dressed in 4 minutes. He told his secretary, in passing, to send a draft for £3,000 to a man named Carew at Threadneedle Street, and to mark it as payment in full of a note held against a Mr. Silas Hartley, and to do it before midday. The secretary, who was accustomed to his employer, made a note and asked no questions. Edmund took his fastest horse, a grey gelding he trusted on all surfaces, and he rode out through Grosvenor Place and onto the Bath Road, because the Dorset Road branched from it, and a post-chaise hired at 5 and weighted with luggage would be moving at 10 miles per hour if it was moving well, and he was on a horse. He found the chaise on the Marrow Road, 3 miles outside the village, on a long straight stretch, where the hedgerows were high and the morning air still held the night's cold. The driver saw him coming and slowed, because a mounted man moving at that pace on a straight road is generally someone who needs to be attended to. The chaise stopped. The door opened, and Patience looked out at him with an expression that he would remember for the rest of his life, composed and careful, and doing the thing she always did in difficult rooms, and then fractionally not. He was breathing harder than the ride alone accounted for. He said, "I have read your note." She said nothing. "All 8 words," he said. 3 times the hedgerow moved in the morning air. A lark started up somewhere to the left, and then thought better of it. "The debt is paid," he said. "As of this morning, Carew will have confirmation before noon." I want you to know that before I say anything else, because I will not have you think that whatever you decide has anything to do with £3,000. She looked at him steadily. The composure was still there, but it was thinner now, the way ice thins in March when the light begins to have warmth in it. You should be free to choose, he said, quoting her back at herself quietly. So should you. She said, I wrote that note because I did not want you to feel obligated. I know, he said. I understood it perfectly. That is why I rode 12 miles before breakfast. He was not quite smiling. He was something adjacent to it, the first time she had seen anything of the kind on his face, and it rearranged certain things in her understanding of him. Miss Hartley, patience. I have been paying attention in every room you have been in for 6 weeks. I am not conscientious in your direction. I am interested in your direction, which is entirely different, and I find I am not willing to be misread on the point. The lark started again, and this time committed. She said carefully, Your mother arranged Carew. I know, he said. I will speak to my mother. She believes I am a provincial girl with nothing to offer Merrow. She is wrong, Edmund said with the flat certainty of a man pronouncing a fact rather than a defense, and she will come to understand that she is wrong. She usually does, eventually. It simply requires the appropriate occasion. The appropriate occasion arrived 6 days later, at the final assembly of the season, held at Almack's in King Street, which was the particular stage the season reserved for its most ceremonial verdicts. Dorothea had come with Cecily and Cecily's mother, arranged again in their established configuration, and the room was at its fullest and most attentive, 230 people who had spent 4 months cataloging one another's alliances and reversals, and were not likely to miss a significant addition to the record. Edmund arrived at 9:30. He was in formal dress, his bearing precisely what it always was in company, which was to say sufficient to make a room reorganize itself slightly in his direction, without his appearing to require it. He looked for Patience, who was standing near the eastern wall with Silas beside her, Silas having been informed 2 days earlier of the whole of the matter, and having responded with an expressiveness that made his sister briefly concerned for his constitution. She was in the slate-gray wool. She had considered the blue silk that Mrs. Holt had sent round from Merrow House the previous afternoon, accompanied by a note in Edmund's hand that said only, "If you would like it," and she had looked at the blue silk for a long time and chosen the gray. She wanted to be clear. Edmund crossed the room in the way he crossed rooms, which was directly, without apparent awareness of the people he was passing, though he was in fact aware of all of them. Dorothea saw him coming and read his trajectory and said something sharp and low to Cecily. Cecily's mother began a remark. Edmund reached Patience's side and offered his arm, and Patience took it, and then he turned to face the room. He said, in the voice that carried without effort, I wish to make clear to those present that my engagement to Miss Patience Hartley is my considered choice, freely made, and that I expect it to be received as such. The room was very quiet. She is to be the Duchess of Merrow, he said. I recommend that anyone who finds occasion to describe her, otherwise reconsider the accuracy of their description. It was not a long speech. It was 8 sentences. But it landed in the room the way a key turns in a lock that has been stuck for a very long time, with a solidity that altered the whole mechanism. Dorothea stood near the fireplace, with Cecily at her shoulder, and her fan held at the precise angle that had for 30 years preceded her most authoritative pronouncements. The angle held for a moment. Then the fan lowered a fraction, and the angle changed, and anyone watching closely could see the exact moment when a lifetime's confidence in a particular script recognized that the script was not going to be performed tonight. She said quietly to Mrs. Penhaligon, who was inevitably nearby, Edmund has always known his own mind. It was not a capitulation in any formal sense. It was something more precise than that. The first sentence of a different story, one in which she had not lost, but had simply been, on one specific point, wrong. Miss Cecily Vane said nothing at all. She looked at Patience for a moment, the full-on look of someone revising a category, and then she turned to the gentleman at her left and said something gracious and entirely unrelated, which was, Patience thought, to her credit. Silas, standing at Patience's other side, exhaled a breath he had apparently been holding for 6 days. The season ended. The assemblies closed. London disgorged its 2,000 seasonal residents back toward their estates and their summer parishes and their long remedial views of countryside, and Patience and Edmund traveled to Merrow Hall in Wiltshire in the first week of August, preceded by Silas, who was to stay for a fortnight, and had arrived looking considerably better than he had in March. The particular improvement that occurs when a specific 3,000-pound weight is removed from a young man's posture. Merrow Hall was older than Patience had imagined. A long stone house with a south-facing front and windows that were generous for the period, and gardens that had been working gardens before they became ornamental ones and retained, in the bones of their layout, the memory of that original use. Mrs. Holt received them in the front hall with the composed efficiency of a woman who had been managing the house through every variety of ducal circumstance for 22 years and was not to be unsettled by a new arrival. She showed Patience the household rooms with a thoroughness that communicated, without stating that she approved of someone who asked sensible questions about the linen inventory and the kitchen garden calendar. Clara was in the garden when they arrived, engaged in what appeared to be a serious negotiation with a hedgehog she had located beneath the rose border. She looked up when Patience came around the corner of the house, and her watchful eyes did their calculation, and then she said, "He won't come out. I've been waiting 20 minutes." "Hedgehogs are very decided about their schedules," Patience said, and sat down on the garden path beside her. Edmund, who had followed at a short distance, stood at the corner of the house and watched the two of them on the path in the August light, and felt something in his chest adjust itself to a new position, gentle and irrevocable, the way a room settles when a window long stuck is opened and the air finally moves through it. He went to the East Gallery that afternoon. The portrait was still there, leaning against the wall where it had stood for 3 years. He stood before it for a long time in the gallery light. Caroline's face looked back at him, or the painter's rendering of it, and he did not try to account for all the things those 3 years had contained. He simply took the portrait from the wall and rehung it at the far end of the gallery, where the afternoon light was best, and straightened it on its hook, and stepped back. The dust from the frame had come off on his hands. He brushed it away and left the gallery and did not look back. The formal ceremony was performed in the village church in October, witnessed by Mrs. Dra. Holt and Silas and Clara, and half of Wiltshire, which had been waiting with an interest it did not attempt to conceal. Dorothea came, correctly, and without warmth, which was itself a form of acknowledgment that carried more weight than warmth would have. She sat in the front pew and held her prayer book, and did not speak unnecessarily, and when she looked at Patience during the service, the look was not approval, which Patience had not asked for, but it was not the calibrated dismissal either. It was something more difficult to name and more worth having. By December, Merrow Hall had the quality of a house that is becoming rather than merely existing. The kitchen garden had been expanded, on Patience's suggestion, and with Mrs. Rowell Holt's enthusiastic concurrence to include a row of sweet peas along the south-facing wall, which would not produce until spring, but which were already in their trellising waiting. Clara had taken to appearing in the library in the late mornings, ostensibly to read, actually to be in proximity to Patience, who was writing letters or reviewing household accounts, and who made space for Clara at the table without remark, which Clara had determined was the correct response. Silas had returned to London with the debt paid, and his posture restored, and a letter of introduction Edmund had arranged to a solicitor's firm in Gray's Inn, and his most recent letter to Patience had mentioned 3 times in 4 pages. A Miss Thornton, whom he had encountered at a private concert in Bloomsbury, and whom he described with a specificity that told Patience everything she needed to know about his immediate future. On an evening in mid-December, Patience sat in the chair near the library grate, with the snow coming down outside the north window. The kind of snow that fell softly in the dark and accumulated on the kitchen garden's sweet pea trellising and on the rose border where the hedgehog had been found. The fire was built high against the cold. Edmund was in the other chair with a letter he had finished reading, and sat on the arm of the chair while he looked at the fire. He said, after a while, "I have been thinking about the 8 words." She looked at him. "You should be free to choose," he said. "I am." He said it as she had written it, quietly and precisely. "You wrote it as a release. I read it as something else." "What did you read it as?" "A model," he said, "of what I was failing to do." He was quiet for a moment. The fire settled, and the snow came down on the garden, and somewhere above them, in the east gallery, Caroline's portrait hung at the end of the room in the afternoon, light it had been hung for, which would still be there in the morning when the winter sun found it. "I should have said this in August. I should have said it on the Marrow Road." "I'm not always quick on the important things." "You rode 12 miles before breakfast," Patience said. That was not slow. The expression that was not quite a smile crossed his face again, and this time she let herself look at it directly. He reached into his coat and produced the 8-word note. He had kept it, folded once in the same coat pocket where he had put it after reading it on the Marrow Road, and it was worn soft at the crease from being in proximity to him for 4 months. He set it on the library table between them, not as a ceremony, simply as a fact. "This is the thing I have been carrying." She looked at it. "I intend to keep it," he said, "if you have no objection." She did not have an objection. She looked at the note, and at the fire, and at the snow on the window, and at his face in the firelight, which was the composed face she had been reading for 8 months, and could now read clearly, and what it held was exactly what she had been told she should not expect to find. Recognition specific and unconditional. The kind that does not require one to be different from what one is. She had expected to endure. She had not known that endurance sometimes leads you to a library in Wiltshire in December, with the snow outside, and a man who keeps your 8 words in his coat pocket because they told him something true about himself. She reached across and put her hand over the note, not taking it, simply resting there, and his hand covered hers, and the fire burned, and the snow went on quietly outside in the dark. She had come to London, expecting to disappear. She was, at last, entirely found. If Patience's journey has stayed with you this evening, leave a word in the comments about the moment that landed most. Stories like hers endure, because people carry them forward. And your presence here tonight is what makes that possible.